Excellent. So I think, we're starting right on time. Yo voy a pasar la palabra a Julián para darnos la bienvenida.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos y todas por estar aquí esta mañana. 6:12 de la mañana en Colombia, creo que las 7 en Nueva York, la 1 en Viena. Bueno, entonces, primero que todo, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este evento alterno que lleva por nombre Uso y Regulación de Drogas en Adultos, el futuro de las políticas de drogas, realizado por la Corporación Acción Técnica Social de Colombia e Instituto RIA de México en el marco del CND 2021. Buenos días para quienes se conectan a este evento alterno de la 64 versión de la Comisión de Narcóticos de las Naciones Unidas, que por razones de pandemia nos convoca de manera virtual este año. Damos un saludo especial a los delegados de los gobiernos, las agencias multilaterales, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y las personas consumidoras de drogas en todo el mundo que nos ven virtualmente. Queremos enviar un abrazo de afecto y fortaleza a todas las personas que se han visto afectadas por la pandemia de manera directa o indirecta, haciendo también un llamado a la solidaridad y la empatía con quienes más han sufrido. Hoy vengo a presentarles una conversación tranquila y pausada de 3 colegas, amigos, que durante los últimos años hemos querido materializar en proyectos, en comportamientos, en actitudes, en servicios y en prácticas cotidianas las ideas de reformar la política de drogas, el derecho al libre desarrollo de la personalidad, la regulación de los mercados ilegales, el consumo responsable, la reducción de riesgos y daños, el placer, la felicidad, el papel que como consumidores de drogas jugamos en reformas de las políticas de drogas todos los días. Vengo a plantearles una conversación entre adultos y de cómo nuestro uso y consumo de drogas en un contexto de prohibición puede aportar de manera significativa a lograr la regulación de todas las drogas. Les presento a mi querida amiga Sara SNAPP. Ella es licenciada en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad de Colorado en Denver y maestra en Políticas Públicas por la Universidad de Harvard, donde obtuvo una beca completa. Cofundadora del Instituto RIA, una organización que hace investigación e incidencia sobre las políticas de drogas desde una perspectiva de derechos humanos, desarrollo y justicia social. Sara es autora del Diccionario de Drogas y numerosos artículos y capítulos de libros, y también orgullosamente desde hace muchos años es la vocera internacional de Acción Técnica Social. El doctor HART, les puedo contar que nació en Miami, que es neuropsicofarmacólogo, profesor de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York y una de las figuras internacionales más conocidas en impulsar la reforma de las políticas de drogas desde la evidencia científica en su laboratorio, elaborando discursos con una alta carga política y social, para complementarlo con su experiencia de vida con las sustancias desde su lugar en el mundo como un afroamericano. Acaba de publicar su libro Drogas para adultos, persiguiendo la libertad en el país del miedo, que ha generado un revuelo en todas las esferas preocupadas por la guerra contra las drogas. Y entonces aquí voy a hacer como esta pequeña introducción. Y la última vez que pude interactuar con el doctor HART fue hace poco más de un mes, cuando lamentábamos juntos como periodistas de una de las principales emisoras de Colombia, atraídos por el amarillismo que generó el hecho de que un profesor de su nivel, de su talla, reconoció el consumo de heroína y además ser ampliamente funcional. Ellos no lo podían creer y perdieron la oportunidad de conocer las provocadoras y atractivos postulados de su libro. Ese día, además, tuvo la oportunidad Carjal de evidenciar el desconocimiento de la prensa sobre los temas profundos de drogas, pues terminó dándoles una lección de legislación colombiana, recordándoles que en Colombia está despenalizado el porte y consumo de la dosis mínima, de la que él tenía un amplio conocimiento, además cuando había venido a Colombia por allá en el año 2018 y en otras ocasiones, pero que los periodistas con altanería e ignorancia negaban. Tranquilo, doctor Hart, que en este no será el centro de esta conversación y vamos a intentar ir a lo profundo. Entonces, como abrebocas, cuando hablamos de consumo de drogas en adultos, hay varios puntos donde nos hemos encontrado con Sara y con el doctor Hart, y creo que cada uno lo abordará de diferentes maneras. Siempre que te hablan de adultos, se supone hablar de responsabilidad sobre nuestros actos. En ese sentido, ¿qué puede ser responsable frente al consumo de drogas? Por ejemplo, buscar siempre la funcionalidad puede ser una de las claves. La incorporación de hábitos de reducción de riesgo y daño, autocuidado, el monitoreo constante de nuestra salud física y mental, hacer análisis de sustancias, saber manejar una crisis, conocer síntomas de intoxicación, saber dosificarse. Entiendo lo adulto como un comportamiento responsable, que muchas veces tienen algunos menores de edad más que aquellos que les duplican la edad. Ser responsable también es preocuparse por cambiar las políticas que no permiten un disfrute libre y seguro de drogas. El segundo aspecto, creo que es el placer y la felicidad. La satisfacción como efecto es positivo para reconocer, estudiar y gestionar. Nadie usa drogas para tener una mala experiencia y muy pocas personas lo hacen para gestionar un problema de su salud física y mental, para olvidar o responder a un trauma. La búsqueda del placer es un objetivo legítimo que se debe defender y maximizar. La representación de los medios de comunicación. Hablar de consumo no es hablar de dependencia problemática o adicción. Siempre hablan del 10 o el 12% que tiene problemas, pero no se ocupan del 88% que no los tiene. Guardan silencio por el estigma y corren mucho peligro por no poder acceder a la información para su salud. El fracaso de la guerra contra las drogas es también y ante todo el fracaso de los medios de comunicación al ponerse al servicio del poder prohibicionista y no de la evidencia reformadora. Por último, todos nos encontramos mucho acá en salir del closet psicoactivo y mostrarse para derribar los estereotipos y dar paso a la confianza y apoyo para quienes no lo han hecho. Respetar también la decisión de quienes no lo han hecho y nunca lo van a hacer. Tenemos un manifiesto para salir del closet psicoactivo en nuestra página web del proyecto Échele Cabeza por si lo quieren ver. Empezando siempre por el reto ante los médicos, quienes no deben juzgarnos por nuestro comportamiento, sino buscar mejorar la calidad de vida de nuestra, así como lo hacen sin sermones con quienes abusan del azúcar o del alcohol. Ya bueno, entonces para darle paso al doctor Hart, que sé que fue lo que vinieron a escuchar, la conversación con Sara también, yo quiero dejarle dos preguntas al doctor Hart para que inicie la conversación y la retome Sara. Yo creo firmemente que la reforma de política de drogas también hace parte de un cambio generacional. La mayoría no va a cambiar de padecer, así la evidencia del fracaso lo supere y hay prohibicionistas que van a morir con las botas puestas. Eso va a pasar en el mundo científico, en los médicos, en los sociólogos, en los periodistas, en los políticos, solo por mencionar algunos, pero también va a pasar en las personas consumidoras. Yo le puedo apostar que la mayoría de sus fans son muy jóvenes y están empezando una carrera de la cual usted puede ser uno de esos guías. Entonces, una pregunta es, ¿cuáles son los mensajes claves que usted le enviaría a esos burócratas, técnicos y funcionarios públicos jóvenes para que puedan gestionar e impulsar el cambio desde adentro? Y la segunda pregunta sería, asimismo, ¿cuál es el llamado o la invitación que usted le haría a los jóvenes que apenas inician en el consumo, que son adultos muy jóvenes y que van a empezar a vivir esta experiencia? ¿Cómo hacer para que lleguen a un consumo adulto y responsable que maximice los placeres, reduzca los riesgos y se asuman en la causa del cambio de política de drogas? Bienvenido, doctor Carhart. Le doy la palabra y el control de la conversación a Sara. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Sarah. I guess the thing that I really would encourage young people to think about is just simple things like justice. When we think about the issues of justice in the United States, for example, we have a lot of problems with police killing Black people. And the pretext for the police to interact with Black people has a lot to do with drug law enforcement, enforcing drug laws that are petty, small, like recently in Minnesota, we had a killed maybe 4 days ago, Dante Wright. The police were trying to arrest him or interact with him because of a marijuana violation, a minor marijuana violation, where we have a number of states that have legalized marijuana. And so when we think about the police interacting with people because of some drug violation, really because somebody is trying to alter their consciousness, somebody is seeking pleasure, and the police are trying to arrest them for that sort of thing, that is silly. So when we think about the young people, I hope young people will stand up and see how stupid that is, how you can kill somebody because they were trying to alter their consciousness, trying to have a good time. So as we move forward, I hope young people really advocate for changing the law such that they law enforcement decrease their interactions with people, such that law enforcement gets out of the business of drug enforcement. Because law enforcement in the United States, certainly, and around the world has become so deadly just in terms of enforcing drug laws. If we think about that, we are killing somebody because they put a substance in their body. That doesn't make any sense under any conditions. And so I hope young people will understand and get out there and advocate for changing this clear wrong situation. That's one of my strongest messages to young people. Stand up, show how ridiculous this current situation is, and really highlight this. There are too many people dying simply because they are they choose to alter their consciousness. Imagine if someone is killing you because you choose to put sugar in your body. That's what's happening around the world. So I hope young people stand up and say no to that. And as young people decide to alter their own consciousness with psychoactive substances, I hope they seek out information, people that will help them to decrease any potential harms and enhance the pleasures that they're seeking, enhance the good time that they're seeking, because there is a growing amount of information on this subject. People feel more comfortable publishing, talking about the subject. I certainly feel more comfortable talking about it. And there are a number of us who have experience. People in the scientific literature have published papers helping people to stay safe as they go about using psychoactive substances for altering their consciousness, for seeking pleasure, for increasing empathy, or whatever other sort of state that they are seeking. So that's it. I hope young people stand up on behalf of those people who are suffering at the hands of drug law enforcement. And I hope young people seek out the best available information to stay safe and to stay happy. That's it.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the concerns we have in Mexico, because even though, and lots of folks are commenting in the chat that they're working on this, so it is a global movement, and that's good. And it's one of the things in Mexico that we're concerned about, because even with the regulation bill that's being proposed around cannabis, it still opens the door to interactions with the judicial system. You would still be able to be detained while they figure out how much you are carrying, and from there determine whether there's a sanction or a fine, and that puts people at risk. The human rights violations within the war on drugs, and how we've justified killing people, actively disappearing them, extrajudicial executions, because they are because they have any substance in their body, or because there might be the idea that they have a substance, or they're somehow related to the market. Because even beyond just consumption, obviously in some of our countries, one of our concerns is also about people who are engaged in any production part, cultivation, small scale, just you have contact with a psychoactive substance, and therefore the state and or other non-state actors have a right to take your life. And you've talked about this. I'm going to switch up my questions just because of how the conversation's going. You've written about this in your book, and I think it's a hugely important book right now for the world, because it gives folks courage to talk about this. You've written about some of the leaders in the world that are justifying this sort of extrajudicial executions. How do you see this contradiction between sometimes government leaders who might even have used substances, but now turn around and are ordering the killings of people who use a different substance? How do we begin to even that cognitive dissonance that is existing on an international level. And for those who, the folks who are listening to this have been listening to the CND all week, no, so they are aware that this is happening. How do we begin to create some coherence there?
Yeah, when we think about, there are some world leaders, for example, who are actively engaged in a drug war that is killing tens of thousands of people. I can think about in the Philippines, their president, Duterte. He is particularly going at the people who use methamphetamine, people who sell methamphetamine. And by that same token, he is a known user of opioids like fentanyl, and he likes fentanyl, and he talks about the pleasures of opioids. So what we have to do as an international community, we have to stop participating in drug exceptionalism, where we say things like, oh, psychedelics, they're okay, but heroin is not okay, or but cocaine is not okay. So when we hear people engaging in this drug exceptionalism, cannabis is okay, but cocaine is not okay. No, these are all chemical substances, and they're just chemicals that interact in your body, in your brain. All of this meaning that we put on these different substances, that's a human sort of phenomena, but the body doesn't see chemicals in that way. And so we have to make sure that we engage people, tell people not to engage in this drug exceptionalism, because when we do that, what we're doing is that we're setting a situation up to where people can say, this is a bad drug, but this is a good drug. There are no such things are bad drugs or good drugs. These are all just inert substances waiting for a biological substance, biological system to interact with. And so we have to make sure we don't participate in a drug exceptionalism, because drug exceptionalism leads to specific drug users being arrested, specific drug users being killed. So if we are participating in drug exceptionalism, then we're participating in the subjugation of other drug users, or some drug users that may use a substance that we don't use. And so we can't participate in it, and we have to be cognizant of that.
Definitely. It's one of the things that when we were working on the cocaine report in 2016 for the United Nations General Assembly special session, you know, people would say, oh, we are so far away from having that conversation. They are going to regulate MDMA way before we ever get to cocaine. And Julian and the other folks who were working on that, and you can look up anyone can look up the study, you know, we were forecasting what would regulation look like in 2034, because you have to begin to also to be able to put the evidence in place so that someday when policymakers and societies are ready to have a conversation, the evidence exists on how it would work. Now, and we can begin to look at, it would not just be the coca leaf. No, we are talking about cocaine. We are talking about hydrochloride cocaine, powder cocaine. How would folks have access to that? How would adults, you know, grown-ups have access to that? Sure, there would be different ways to access. There would be restrictions, but what does that really look like? And that was a hard conversation to have in Vienna in 2016, because from ATS and RIA, we've been proposing side events from the beginning that kind of break with the mold. We started with drug checking, then we talked about cocaine regulation, then peace building with drug policy, and now we're having a conversation about drug use for adults. No, and we've tried to also break with the model of even how we do side events. You know, done interactions, which government officials are always a bit scared of, and now we get to have this conversation with you, which is amazing, because you really are breaking the mold on how we should be talking about psychoactive substances. And one of the things that I took from the book that was so important was, how do we begin to identify faulty science, evidence that is presented to us? And this is something that happens throughout the CND. It happens all the time. that is what is presented oftentimes. Academic journals are publishing those articles. We're seeing those brain scans. I think, everyone should have read your book if they haven't. And for many of us, we're waiting for it to come out in Spanish as well, so we can give it the push it needs in Latin America. How do we, and even folks from NIDA and Nora Volkov presented at the CND this week. What should we be watching out for when we see that sort of faulty science, or how do we question that? What are the tools one would need to know, maybe not being a neuroscientist?
So one of the things that people should recognize immediately is that all of the drugs that we're talking about, whether it's cocaine, whether it's heroin, whether it's MDMA, whether it's marijuana, one of the things that people should recognize is that all of these substances are substances that we give in the laboratory to human research participants. And we've been doing this for years, for decades. And we give thousands of doses of these drugs every year in these laboratories around the world. And NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, funds the predominant amount of this research. So the thing that we have to understand is that if these drugs were so awful, as some of these people say, then we would not be allowed to give these drugs to human research participants with the blessing of the US taxpayers, with the US government. So it doesn't fit. Why would you allow people to give drugs that are so dangerous to people? And we give drugs to folks, and you see the data that is produced in these research studies. The data that are produced, the data overwhelmingly shows positive effects. But those data are not emphasized when you have people like Nora Volkov speaking to the public. What she emphasizes are data that are not from people who we've given drugs to, instead from people who haven't gotten drugs, but they're identified as drug users. And so she would present some brain scan, for example, of the people who have reported using drugs versus people who don't use drugs. And so when you start to see these brain scans, the important thing that people should understand is think about not only are there brain measures like what size is the structure and that sort of thing. Not only that, you need to understand whether or not there is a behavioral outcome. There is a behavioral measure. Say, how well do these people perform cognitively? How well do these people accomplish this behavioral task? How well did those participants perform in terms of making it to your study, in terms of how well did they do in terms of completing your study, in terms of following your directions. In all of these studies, research participants follow directions. They meet all of these stringent requirements. And then we want to say that there's something wrong with them. It doesn't make sense. So people need to make sure that they ask those kind of questions when you have people presenting things like brain scans. Say, are these people functioning at the level of someone with their educational background, with their age, and that sort of thing. And what you find is that these people overwhelmingly perform within a normal range. So you don't only compare them to a control group, but you compare them to people of the same age, same educational background, same occupational sort of expertise. That's how you have to, you ask these kind of questions, then you will start to see that these folks are normal. Another thing that people should ask when they are listening to those type of researchers, they should ask whether or not the researcher talked about the negative consequences as a result of drug policy. Does the researcher say anything about the social conditions that people have to face and the consequences that they face? For example, do they talk about the numbers of people who are arrested for drugs as a negative consequence? Do they talk about the paranoia that people experience because of law enforcement, and these are very real, but people don't talk about, not these researchers, they don't talk about this sort of thing. And do they talk about things like the selective drug law enforcement for certain groups, poor people, Black people in the US? Are we talking about those folks as a result of our drug policy, the consequences that those people are faced with? Those are very important. And another component that is rarely talked about by these researchers, sometimes they present animal data and human data as if they're the same thing. And they do it in a way that they're talking about the two like they're interchangeable, when in fact they're not. So if we're starting to talk about some neurotoxicity, it's easy to talk about neurotoxicity in laboratory animals because you can push the dose of a drug to 10, 20, 40 times that of what a human will take. And then you can see some neurotoxicity or cell death as a result. But humans will never take that large of a dose. So it's not even relevant to the human condition. So you can subject laboratory animals to conditions which you will not subject humans to, or humans won't be subjected to it. And then you talk about their results like you're talking about humans. So people have to understand whether or not the data that are being talked about are data collected in laboratory animals or data collected in humans. All of those points are critical. That is, I'll just recap. We think about when people present neuroimaging data, brain data, do they have a behavioral outcome? That's important. And then when we think about the negative consequences of drug use, when they're talking about the negative consequences, are they talking about the negative consequences of policy, of law enforcement? If they're not, then you can stop listening because this person is not giving you a comprehensive understanding of the picture. And then finally, are they separating laboratory data collected in laboratory animals from data collected in humans? If they're not doing that sort of thing, and if they're conflating the two, then they are trying to trick you. And so people need to understand that.
Yeah, hugely important. I think that everyone who's listening, these are the tools that we need in order to be able to sometimes question, even when you think about university students or folks who are getting this training as psychologists or as neuroscientists or within any of these disciplines. I know that in my university, that was part of what we were shown, no, when we were taught about how substances function in our body. And that there really also is no space for neurodiversity, like that our brains work differently already without, substances, and your brain will react differently than mine. Um, and how much of that, and that's something we always talk about, what are the possible, how does policy affect us and how does the substance affect us? And obviously, if your interactions with government, with the state, have been always negative, when you take a psychoactive substance, your setting is so different from what the setting is of someone who has lived with privilege around them, which in my case, living in Mexico, I'm able to talk about my use openly. And I have been for many years, but it's because I'm a white woman who is not being stopped on the street. And there are millions of people who, because they're young, because they look a certain way, because they're from certain geographical parts of the country, are stopped. And there's just a stigma and a discrimination that is inherent in how our laws are applied in a discriminatory fashion. And this is something that we, when we try to apply social justice principles to any policy, but really when we're talking about regulation, we bring it up. That's the first principle. You have to recognize the dynamics of privilege and oppression that already exist. And so I want to go back to that, and we talked about it. How do we begin dismantling those structural inequities? How do we talk about this? The George Floyd, the case is going on right now. About the testing, the forensic testing that they do to folks when these murders are happening. and they, it's happening all around the world, if you want to talk about other contexts as well, but like, how do we begin dismantling this, thinking about it on a global level, but also folks who are on the ground doing the work?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are no shortcuts. If we if we're going to have change in the world, for any sort of thing where people are being oppressed, power concedes nothing without a demand, and so people have to demand change, and that oftentimes mean that you might have to put your body out there. You might have to sacrifice something yourself. I mean, I think about just what I'm trying to do. I'm out of the closet. I'm writing a book talking about my own drug use, not because I really want people to know what I do privately. This is something I've done, but it comes a point in your life where you have to say, like, you have to lay something on the line. Because if you don't get out there and lay something on the line, it's not going to change. The problem is that our opinion makers around the world, the people in the media, the people in politics, the people all around the world who are opinion makers in our society, they are the most privileged people. They are our scientists. They are all of these folks who are doing well. And they may use drugs and they will be fine because drug law enforcement is not looking for them. And so the problem is they're not coming out of the closet. They're not putting anything on the line. So we have to call out the opinion makers, people who are journalists, especially the journalists. When people make bad movies about drugs, which they always do, when we think about people who are making movies about drug trafficking, call that out, because that's oftentimes cheap thrills. And there are a number of people who are making those movies, their TV shows. We have to call that nonsense out. When our comedians make fun of drugs when they really don't know what they're talking about, call it out. We have to call out all of this nonsense, because the more they produce this nonsense, the more people are dying who are not opinion makers. The more of those folks are going to jail because of somebody's stupid joke that they continue to perpetuate, because of somebody's awful documentary film or awful film. We have to call those filmmakers out. We have to call out journalists who write stupid stories about the opioid crisis and they don't know what they're talking about. We have to call out people. We have to call out scientists who perpetuate this nonsense. That's why we call out those people who show the brain imaging without talking about what police are doing to communities, like the people like Nora Volkov and those folks. Call them out. If we call them out, just like in the United States, for example, we called out people for the Me Too movement, we call out these people in a similar way, we will get change. But if we don't call people out, it's not going to happen. If we don't lay our bodies on the line, it's not going to happen. And so I really encourage people to be active, and I encourage them to think about the people like the George Floyds, think about the people like the Dante Wrights, the people who are being killed. Because we oftentimes think about people going to prison. Oftentimes in the United States, our drug law enforcement, you don't go to jail, you get shot up and killed. And so we have to think about those folks who are dying. And so I can't say it more passionately. Join us in calling out these people.
Yeah, and I think it's part of, how do you have these conversations on a personal level when you witness this stigma also? I mean, it's the big people who make decisions. I like how you put the opinion makers, policymakers, those who are using in the privacy of their homes. But then also, how do you, when we have greater tools, we can have that conversation with our families, and we can have that conversation one-on-one, which is really where we also start to change minds about very small things. And the thing about the media is so key, because and we've watched the interviews that they've done with you, and Julian mentioned the interview they did a month ago in Colombia, just badly framed. And with Nuria Calzada in Spain, we often talk about, we've had to take over some of these media sources where they let us, occupy these spaces, because we don't have, because the reporters, the journalists, the media companies aren't saying the right things. They're not asking those questions. And so Noria and Julian have been writing for Cáñamo magazine. I have a TV show now on cannabis in Mexico. So it's like these ways of, we have to be the voices, because otherwise you don't know what's going to come out. And I probably, all of us have been interviewed on, I want to talk about drug trafficking and who are the leaders of the drug traffickers and the women who've led drug trafficking in history. And you're just like, this is not the conversation we need to be having. This is not the conversation, but this is where the conversation sometimes goes. And you say yes to the interview, and then you answer the question you wish they had asked, the intelligent question that you wish they had asked, which is something that I think is important for all of us who are working in this field, who begin to talk to folks. I wanna change gears a little bit to, and Julian mentioned it at the beginning, the importance of happiness, the importance of pleasure. We spend a week at the CND where the governments are talking about all these horrible things that they're doing, eradicating crops, incarcerating people, the sword, and how far can the sword reach to be able to control drugs, which was a quote from the Philippines a few years ago. And then you also see people that you love, and you have this great global movement that's working together. And I think even in the last couple of years, more people who are in this global movement have been more comfortable talking about their use. 5 years ago, people weren't talking about their use. They weren't talking about the pleasure that substances bring. With greater participation of young people, we're also seeing a change in, the side events that happen. But you still have the side events that say, all drugs are bad, and here's what we're going to do, to get rid of them within a ridiculous number of years, as if the world would be a better place. So when we talk about the importance of happiness, and the UN General Assembly approved in 2012 that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental human right, and that objective, and it also even invites member states to promote policies that include the importance of happiness, the general well-being of citizens. In Mexico, the regulation is based on a jurisprudence around the free development of personality. What does that mean? The free development of personality. That opens the door to anything, but it also opens the door to that you have to have a conversation. And you talk about this in your book too, grown-ups. What does being a grown-up mean? It means being able to enjoy something. When I was like using drugs and I'm in a parking lot, in the middle of the night, you're not actually enjoying it to its fullest extent. You are, taking risks. And so when we talk about that, how do we bring that message? How do we, and maybe it's a conversation with young people of like, if you are going to use, here's how you take into account certain pieces of your own life so that you can have that conversation. I mean, this is really about the education around whether you're going to consume or not. How do we build in this piece of pleasure, happiness, and the free development of personality and the rights related to those?
Yeah, this is a really simple concept. That's why I try to, it's been made to be more complicated and more complex than it really should be. It's very simple, this notion of you have the right to pursue pleasure. You don't have the, we don't, or you have the right to pursue happiness. You don't, we're not guaranteeing you happiness or pleasure, but we are guaranteeing you the right to do so. And however you decide in your pursuit of these sort of constructs, that's fine. The point is that as long as you are not bothering anyone or disrupting their ability to do the same, it's cool. Now, how you decide to do that, that's your business. Now, as we grow, as we develop, we may choose various activities at one stage of life and another activity at another stage of life. So it's a dynamic process. You might, for example, do video games as an adolescent, and you get older, you might do alcohol, and then as you get even older, you may change your psychoactive substance or what have you. And it's a dynamic process. And this dynamic process requires that you have a trial and error, you make mistakes, you try and get the best available information on all of these activities. And so you have to also allow people the leeway to make mistakes, which is okay. That's part of being human. And that's what we're there for. That's why we have our safety nets, to allow people to make mistakes and allow people to be okay. But we just want to make sure that their mistakes are not lethal or deadly. When we push people off into the shadows, it increases the likelihood of their mistakes being potentially lethal or deadly. And so that's what we have to remember as a society. We don't want to push people off into the shadows because they are going to make mistakes. It's just part of being a human. And so we have to think about this from the perspective of people who are providing services. That's one of the reasons why when I think about, we call this huge field harm reduction. And there's nothing about pleasure in that title. I mean, of course, what we do in harm reduction is important. We provide very important services, but that term is always paired with drugs. Harm paired with drugs. Harms paired with drugs. And so you can understand why a society might think of drugs only in terms of harms. You can understand why people who are ignorant about drugs may only think of drugs in terms of these harmful effects, these negative effects and so that's why I encourage people, let's get rid of the term harm reduction so we can get rid of this pairing. Some people misunderstood and said, oh, you don't like harm reduction, as if I didn't like what we were doing in harm reduction. Of course, I love what we're doing in harm reduction. And so I have to think about, like my wife has said about this thing, what, like she said, think about it like if you're saying, don't pair Mary with ugly, ugly Mary every time, ugly Mary. And then I'm saying, don't pair ugly with Mary. And then someone says to me, why don't you like ugly Mary? You know, and so it's like, it's not about not liking ugly Mary. It's about the terms. We don't want to pair ugly with Mary because Mary is not ugly. That's so the same is true here. What we do in harm reduction is cool, but the pairing of harm and drugs over and over, it shapes our thinking, shapes our behavior, shapes how we see this activity. And so we really have to think about getting rid of that term or modifying it such that harms are not consistently paired with drugs. And so when we think about this notion of pleasure, happiness, we have to emphasize that when we think about people who take drugs. When folks say things like, oh yeah, I'm taking this to heal some pain, or they're taking drugs because they're in pain, we need to pipe up and say, hold up, this is not about pain. This is about my happiness. This is about my opic moment, my time to myself, for me to chill, to have a good time, to whatever. But it's not about escaping pain. It's not about escapism. It's about going to this place to be happy, to be pleasurable, it's about enjoying my friends. It's about enjoying my loved ones. And so we have to make sure we correct that sort of pairing also, because the media is comfortable with folks, for example, taking psychedelics to achieve some spiritual enlightenment or to search for some healing. I mean, that's okay if people are doing that, that's fine. But many of us are not necessarily doing that. We're doing it because we enjoy the pleasure, and that's okay. And so we have to be okay with just having a good time. There's nothing wrong with having a good time, because if we're having a good time, we're more likely to treat other people around us better. People who are happy, that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Exactly. And even some of these, I feel like there's so many terms we have to reclaim. So even thinking about, aging out, which we talk about that a lot, of people have this experimental time in their lives and then they age out. And what does that mean? And if anything, we should be, like saying there's actually there's probably a positive time in your life when you might incorporate certain psychoactive substances, when you have the time to reflect, when you're not caring for small children, when you're not going to school. I mean, we can think as a mother of a young child, I don't really have time sometimes to have a long, I have to figure out what are the moments, that you can take and really enjoy that. And I think everybody in your life, that's what you have to do. You have to examine what is the moment. But we have these terms that, and we even use them in our writing or in speaking, or and that it's something, Rick Doblin always, from MAPS, he would talk about, what does it feel like to use substances, and how good sometimes it feels when you feel good. When you feel good, you feel that connection to the universe, and that's what you are seeking, really. And if it is to treat pain, then there's probably other pieces around it. It's the situation. There's other conditions that we would need to be exploring beyond just a substance. And this is something that in our societies we're being taught, oh, I'll take a pill every day and then I'll be okay. And but the person who takes a pill or smokes something every day that isn't within the medical model is not okay. And this is something even you've talked about is, folks who have access to healthcare, you're getting prescribed a lot of these molecules. You're getting prescribed them legally if you have access to healthcare. If you don't have healthcare, then you're having, which in the United States is very common, then you have to find them on an illegal market, and that's where all these risks come in. And so it's all part of this inequality that we're seeing. I know we're coming towards the close because we're trying to be respectful of times of the UN, but also we know that they don't have that much control over us because they can't kick us out of a room or anything. We are in charge of our own destiny today. So that's good. I want to ask just about when, for many of us in Latin America, we're anxiously waiting the book in Spanish. When will it be coming out? How do we get you then to come down to Mexico and Colombia? We'd love to give you a Latin America tour where we can really be talking about these issues. And obviously, we know that it's so crucial for our region.
I think it comes out in Spain this summer. So it should be released, I think, midsummer in Spain. I think Nuria has been in contact with the Spanish publisher more than I have, and she actually is making sure that they don't screw up the title, because they'd already tried to screw up the title, and Nuria caught it. So thank you, Nuria. And so when that happens, I'm happy to come to Latin America, that. And I can't wait till the world opens back up so I can come to places like Mexico and Colombia, so I can see my people again. So I miss hanging out with Julian and everybody who takes care of me when I'm down there. I really miss it.
Excellent. I think Julian wanted to ask one final question too, and then I might do a little closing. Julian, te quitas de mute.
Yo creo que más que pregunta me voy muy animado como siempre. Me gustó mucho de llamarlos a rendir cuentas. Creo que eso es algo que se enmarca mucho en el tema de las veedurías. En Colombia le llamamos desde lo público, pero también desde lo ciudadano. Entonces me institucionalizaré una más. Creo que también me voy con otra provocación, Carl, y es que creo que hay que pedirle a nuestros colegas que si usan sustancias, que intenten empezar por la práctica de no hablar en tercera persona, que se atrevan ocasionalmente a hablar desde la primera persona. Y es que creo que reconocernos como usuarios, como consumidores de sustancias en un contexto de reforma de política. Y es una claridad también, y es que yo no estoy aquí de pie por ser un consumidor de sustancias. Yo estoy aquí porque soy un sociólogo que tiene como objeto de estudio las políticas de drogas y me drogo ocasionalmente. Entonces creo que empezar a avivar eso me gustaría mucho con mis colegas. Y una pregunta es, ¿qué lecciones crees tú que debemos aprender de todo lo que pasó con el alcohol y con la nicotina? ¿Sí? Vemos que ahorita Fue algo muy liberal en un momento, se salió de las manos, el capitalismo salvaje lo cogió y lo administró totalmente y pues terminamos viendo las consecuencias que terminamos viendo y hace 10, 15 años empezaron las regulaciones estrictas sobre el tabaco, las regulaciones sobre el alcohol, la restricción de la publicidad, los impuestos, todo esto. En este proceso de regular las sustancias ilegales, ¿qué creerías tú o si has hecho el análisis de qué podremos aprender de la experiencia que tuvimos pues tan desafortunada con el alcohol y con el cigarrillo que hoy en día pues son los que más ponen los muertos en términos de uso de la sustancia y que la categoría de legalidad hace que no nos fijemos mucho en ellas? Gracias, Carlos. Y por acá te espero cuando tengamos libro.
Thank you, Julian. When you think about the lessons that we can learn from alcohol and tobacco, in the US, between 1920 and 1933, we banned alcohol. And during that period, we had tens of thousands of people who were maimed or killed from drinking tainted or poisoned alcohol, contaminated alcohol. When we reversed a prohibition of alcohol, when we made it legal again, those deaths went away. And so the lesson from that is that when we have a safe supply, when we regulate the market such that people have access to pharmaceutical grade drug, you decrease deaths by contamination. And that's where most of the deaths occur when we think about what's going on with overdoses in the United States, for example, with the opioids. We have tainted drugs that people don't recognize that they're getting. Those will go away if you have a safe supply and regulate the market. When I think about something like tobacco, oftentimes people conflate the tobacco product, the plant, the tobacco itself from the tobacco companies and the industry. In the United States, we were upset with the tobacco companies because they misled the public. They lied about their product. They lied about what they knew in terms of cancer potential of the product. They lie in terms of dependence producing potential of the product. And so we were upset with the tobacco industry. They also manipulated the tobacco product such that they added various chemicals in order to enhance the nicotine delivery from the tobacco plant to the brain. They lied about those sorts of things. And so we were upset with them. But please understand, the natural tobacco plant itself is not a bad product. It becomes bad when we have people manipulating and lying about the product. And so if we separate the two, people should have access to tobacco. But the thing is, we just need all of the information so people can make an informed decision. And when we have tobacco, alcohol, or any other product that humans can engage in, we can expect that you will have some risk. And that means that some people might get hurt dealing with those substances, just like people will get hurt driving an automobile. In the United States, every year we lose 40,000 Americans because of car crashes, accidents in cars. But we don't ban cars. What we do is try to work to enhance the safety of driving a car. The same lesson we should learn with these other drugs. With tobacco and alcohol, with alcohol especially, we've learned those lessons, and we're trying to keep people safe such that we decrease the likelihood of people getting injured when taking that substance. So we have to understand that life is not without risk, and we're not going to decrease every possible risk. That's impossible. Anything worth doing carries some risk. Like when the world opens back up, we will all get back on planes. And unfortunately, there might be plane crashes and some of us might lose our life, but that's part of it. And the same is true when we think about drug taking behavior. But the point is that there is far more harm from what we're doing in terms of our current regulation of these drugs than what would happen if we regulated the drugs, made sure we had a safe supply, taught people how to use them, brought people from out of the shadows such that the stigma is decreased, and we are working to keep people as safe as possible. So any regulation where the substances are available is far better than what we're currently doing.
And that is very important as we move forward with public policies. What we want to talk about is how do we reduce the harms of policies, and how do we generate pleasure and happiness in our societies? No, and we're seeing these indexes that begin to measure that. I want to thank you so much for being here with us, for waking up early. When we sent you the email, I was like, it's going to be so early. You said yes. Thank you. I know it's tough for all of us, but you know, we're in the confines here of the UN. I have a few, I mean, I'm taking away a lot from this conversation. I think everyone from the chat is as well. There were questions that came up that you organically answered. There are other questions that if you listen to the interviews that Carl has been doing all over and incessantly, and it's so good because it's people who then come to me and are like, remember that book you recommended to me years ago? Yeah, High Price. I saw that he wrote something in the New York Times. It's like, yes, we're all moving forward. So you're reaching these new audiences that so greatly need this information. But I'm left with a few things that you said. You know, law enforcement needs to get out of drug laws. We need to be keeping, drugs have been a distraction from law enforcement. The government is wasting resources. They're not prioritizing. They're able to bring in stigma, discrimination, bias, racism, classism that exists in our society, and they cannot be the envoys of the state to communities. They cannot be that. How do we stand up and show how ridiculous the situation is? And that is really coming from folks, maybe you consume, maybe you don't, it doesn't matter. You can raise your voice and you can, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. So we need to have our demands. And that's where we're moving forward as a global movement. And I see this every day more and more because people are becoming more interested and they're seeing the intersectionality of these issues. It's not just, oh, I work on drugs and you work on criminal justice, or you work on sacred plants, or you work on, it's how do we bring, you work on feminism, no, you work on the rights of people who are incarcerated. So it's all, how do we take away those stigmas and work together? How do we get rid of drug exceptionalism? This is something we've been talking about for years, of that you can, just because you don't use a drug doesn't mean that it's a bad or good. When we talk about, you know, caffeine and people say, oh, I need a cup of coffee to get up in the morning. It's like, that sounds problematic. You know, what are you thinking? So it's really about how do we also throw this contradiction in, how do we demonstrate it so that folks can have that cognitive dissonance maybe switch in their heads? How do we, you know, how do we call out faulty science, talking about, you know, does the science show a behavioral outcome? Did the researcher identify the policy and social conditions around the consumption? Is there an actual control group? And this is only beginning to happen now also with regulatory models where folks feel comfortable talking about their use, so you can actually do that comparison in a more coherent way, not contain animal and human data. I mean, I cannot recommend more reading Carl's book. It is much needed. For those in the international space, it is giving us tools to be able to apply these lessons to our own context. For those in the United States, this is the manifesto of coming out of the psychoactive closet and what it means. But beyond that, it's based in your experience and your long history of work and your own evolution in thinking, which I think is important too, to recognize. It's not that you have always thought this, you had to come to this And that's like most of us. We're always changing. We want our brains to be changing. We want our bodies and our behaviors to be changing. And so really this book just greatly demonstrates that evolution that we need to be having in all of our societies. So thank you. How do we call out the media, and how do we move towards really giving a place to pleasure and happiness and the pursuit of happiness, recognizing all the contradictions in our history? And as Nuria was putting in the chat, you know, that the Declaration of Independence is written on hemp. And now we have these, you know, how many people are incarcerated and persecuted for cannabis. And so we have to bring up these contradictions that are in our societies. But you've left us with lots of words that we can take, actions that we need to be taking. You know, this is part of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs side events. So it's about local actions, but it's also about talking to your government about how they're showing up at the CND. What are the statements that they're making? Get yourself in touch with them, because they're not hearing from enough of us. They think that they know who's in playing this game. It's your job as someone who wants to advocate for change to find the person who negotiates in Vienna, find the person in capital who's working on these issues, become their friend, talk to them. Many of them are on board, but they don't even know how to have these conversations, you know, and I know, Carl, you've had these conversations with different folks in government of like, they even ask you, well, what does it feel like to take this drug? And what if I want to take it? How should I go around doing it? And you're like, I would love to help you, but you have the power in your hands. This is what we have to, you know, these are the changes we need to be making. So from Acción Técnica Social in Colombia, and from Instituto RIA in Mexico, and from all of our colleagues around the world who admire you so much, we just want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
You know, Sarah, to be with you and Julian, I will go anywhere, including in my house at 7 o'clock in the morning to be with you two. So it's a pleasure being with you two. And I just want to make sure that I leave people with this message. When we think about drugs, oftentimes police are the front lines. They're the ones who are interacting with us and interacting with people who are doing drugs. We just have to make sure we keep in our minds that health and happiness is too of an important function to leave in the hands of police. That's just too important to leave in the hands of police. They will fuck it up every time. So we can't do that. We cannot leave this important human function in the hands of some of the less well-educated people in our society and some of the brutes of our society. And so when we think about, if you want to screw something up, give it to the police. And health and happiness, we don't want to screw that up in any society.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you, Nuria, for always being in La Conspiración. Just to remind you all
Muchas
that
gracias a todos. Thank you very much. Good day.
At 6 p.m. today,
Bye, Carl.
Colombia
Bye,
time and
Sara.
Mexico time, we will be retransmitting this on the Facebook of RIA and ATS. So feel free to share, and feel free to follow us all so that we can be sharing our tips and the advances and retrocesos that we're living in our societies. I know there were questions about what's going on in Colombia with the glyphosato. I know and these are things we're going to have to we will keep talking about. So don't worry, and thank you so much. We're all going to go have a productive day now because we woke up so early. Thanks a lot, and please do find Carl's book, and we'll be sharing it in Spanish when we get it down here during the summer. So drug use for grown-ups. Thank you. Bye.
Adios,
Ciao.
guys.
Bye, ciao.